Ruskin said, great nations write their autobiographies in 3 manuscripts: the book of their deeds, the book of their words, and the book of their art. Not one of these books can be understood unless we read the 2 others, but of the 3, the only trustworthy one is the last.
I must have seen Civilisation in my teens. I guess it was in the 1971 repeat, not the 1969 original, because we didn't have a colour telly. But I still remember seeing it, and it was hugely influential on me. I thought I'd never really grasped before that you could tell a story about culture. There was a history to culture, that you could analyse art. I knew you could go to galleries and that kind of thing, but I didn't ever think there was a big picture to the story of culture. And so it made an enormous difference to my life, and in some ways, one of the reasons I ended up doing what I do. When I look at the programmes now, he's telling a story which remains entirely, really, a European story. And Greece and Rome, France, Italy, Germany, and Britain. Now, you look at it now and you think, he doesn't even go to Spain. Now, to be fair to Clark, he had wanted to include Spain, but, in some early version of BBC trimming things, the Spanish episode went. But that's not to say it doesn't still engage me in some ways. I think, you can't help but, I think, really admire the way that you do have a narrative constructed for you that begins to make sense. And it's exciting. And the one thing I remember from when I first watched it, the real moment, was in the first episode. And it was when he says, we got by, we got through by the skin of our teeth.
All the life-giving human activities that we lump together under the word civilization have been obliterated once in Western Europe, when the barbarians ran over the Roman Empire. For 2 centuries, the heart of European civilization almost stopped beating. We got through by the skin of our teeth.
And I remember then, here I am in my mid-teens, and I was bought by that. I thought, gosh, culture only survived by a thread. Now, 50 plus years on, I know it isn't quite so simple. At one point he says, looking at the famous Greco-Roman statue of the Apollo Belvedere, he says, once upon a time this was the most famous statue in the world. And you think, it wasn't famous in India, mate.
This is from the figure that was once the most admired piece of sculpture in the world. The Apollo surely embodies a higher state of civilization.
I think that Clark's real skill was to make the history of culture seem exciting. You wanted to watch the next episode. What happens next? There was a narrative there and a story that you wanted to follow. And I think in some ways that when we remade Civilization to include the rest of the world and put an S on the end, Civilizations, what we lost was the story, because there isn't a narrative of world art. So we very much kind of channel down into different areas and different themes. And I think that was a loss, actually. And I think that Clark makes you want to know what happens next. So I think I admire that. And I admire the sense of personal commitment that went into that. You felt that he felt it. I mean, it does take a bit of an effort sometimes to see through the kind of apparently posh exterior, but he's feeling something about this, and that, I think, is what draws you in. I now find I'm listening for when he's just hinting that for all that kind of posh veneer, there's more doubts in his mind too. And I kind of know that there are, because, having done some work now, I know he wanted to put Spain in. And, I now know that he worked on art that wasn't European. So I'm listening out for that. And partly, I think, listening through the fluency rather than at the fluency. And one of the biggest eye-openers for me was when I discovered that he actually did all the pieces to camera off an auto cue. And people always come up, when they want to criticise people like me, they say, oh, you don't have that kind of the fluency of Lord Clark. No, we don't, because we're not reading it off the auto cue, mate.
People sometimes tell me that they prefer barbarism to civilization. I doubt if they've given it a long enough trial. Like the people of Alexandria, they are bored by civilization. But all the evidence suggests that the boredom of barbarism is infinitely greater.
I also think it's quite interesting that, like many television programmes that we now think of as the classics, I, Claudius would be another example, it wasn't an instant hit. The viewing figures when it was first broadcast were very small. Now, that's partly because it was broadcast on BBC Two and made in colour and people didn't have access to it. But even so, it didn't kind of make much of an impact until it went to the United States. And it went on PBS in the States. And I've spent quite a lot of time in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. They still remember making the decision to show Clark's Civilisation. And it was absolutely packed. They ended up showing individual episodes just back to back all day so people could come and see them. And that, I think, is what really gave it its lift. And then it was repeated on BBC One in 1971, and at that point it felt like it began to feel like a classic here too. It has a huge following. I mean, even now, Clark's version of what the history of Western art was, or the history of art was, absolutely kind of hit a chord. And and I know that because if ever I dare to say, as I'm doing now, I have certain doubts about the kind of art history that this is, criticise Clark a bit, I tell you, I get as big a Twitter storm then as I've got for anything. So he's hugely important, I think slightly nostalgically, but I think more than that, in our version of how we tell our culture story to ourselves.
I wonder if a single thought that has helped forward the human spirit has ever been conceived or written down in an enormous room.
I really hope that lots of people will watch this. And I hope that they'll do it giving it a bit of the benefit of the doubt. I think that it would be a shame if all that people said when they'd seen it was, well, there wasn't much outside Europe, It would be a shame if they just repeated my kind of sense of unease. I also hope that some people who are, very definitely in the cult of Clark watch it, perhaps watch it again, and think about, what are you missing? Have you not noticed the rest of the world exists? And I think that, the difficulty is just wondering how far Clark found that awkward. We know he found omitting Spain awkward and he wanted to have it in. But I wonder if he'd been around now and had been given a mega budget, would he still just have done Europe? Or would he have somehow found a way, which I certainly couldn't find, of telling that kind of exciting story across the whole globe? That would be nice, if he could.